If you were to say, this one thing I know, what would your next words be? Welcome to Loveland Bible Study. If you have been with us, you know that we are walking through the book of John. We're doing a bit of a survey of each chapter, but we've kind of gotten stuck the last few weeks in John chapter 9. This story of Jesus and the blind man is really engaging. And if you've been with us, you know that chapter 9 is built around 8 conversations. And the first conversation is the disciples and Jesus. And they're walking with Jesus. They see this blind man who is sitting there begging. And the disciples ask Jesus a very reasonable question. They ask him, who sinned? Whose fault is it that this man is blind? Is it his fault or is it his parents' fault? And Jesus answers them like this. He says, this man was born blind that the works of God would be revealed. I must work the works of him who sent me while it's day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. You know, that seems like a lot of... Boy, if you want to dig into that, we talked about that a week or so ago, but here Jesus is talking about a blind man who has never seen light. He was born blind. And Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And he didn't even say it to that man. He said it to the disciples, but I'm pretty sure that the man could hear it. And then we come to the second conversation, and that's the conversation that Jesus had with the blind man. And you really couldn't even call it a conversation because it was just one sentence. After that conversation with the disciples, Jesus just spit into the dirt, and then he mixed it up and made, the scripture says, clay, like we would call mud, and then he rubbed it on the blind man's eyes and told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. That was the entire conversation. Go wash in the pool of Siloam. And so the blind man gets up and he goes and he washes in the pool of Siloam. And the scripture says that he comes back seeing, that now he can see. And that leads us to the third conversation, which is this formerly blind man and his neighbors, because they look at him and it looks like the guy that they've always known to be blind. And they go, is this the guy? This looks like the guy. And he goes, yeah, look, I'm the guy. That word there that they use for neighbors, it's a really interesting word because it really simply means joined ground. So it's like if you live in a house and you have a neighbor on each side, you know, the ground doesn't stop at your house. It's connected to the ground at their house. So your land is joined with their land. And so the idea behind that word there that they use for neighbor is that these are people that were connected to that guy. They weren't strangers. They weren't people who didn't know him. They were people who knew he was blind and knew he was blind since birth. And they couldn't believe it was him. So they said, man, that looks like the blind guy. Is that the blind guy? And he goes, yeah, It's me. I'm the guy. And so then they ask him, well, what happened? And he said this. He said, a man called Jesus. And then he shares his story with them. And those people, his neighbors, they were stuck. They didn't know what to do. So they kind of had this attitude, we have got to get to the bottom of this. Kind of like an old episode of Columbo. Let's investigate this. Let's figure out what happened. And that leads us to conversation number 4. And that's the formerly blind man and the Pharisees. Now, it's important that we understand who the Pharisees are. Many of you already know, and if you were here, I would ask you to explain it to the people who are watching. But since you're not, let me take a shot at it. That the Pharisees were people who were responsible for Levitical law, its interpretation and its application. And as a result, they were the ones, kind of the judges, that decided if someone was breaking the law or not. And one of the main laws that they were always keeping an eye on was the Sabbath. You remember from Exodus chapter 20, where God gave us the 10 commandments, and he gave us what we know as the 4th commandment, is to remember the Sabbath, to keep it holy. And that seems like kind of a general statement, doesn't it? Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. What does that really mean? How do you do that? How do you know if someone's not doing that? And that's the challenge that we have being human beings. It's part of our nature to rebel, to want to do what we want to do. And so when God gave us these commandments to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy, all kinds of people had different ideas as to what that meant. And like me, maybe not like you, but like me, that I'm always looking for the easiest way. I'm trying to look at the way that best serves me. And so they followed these 39 things that you're not supposed to do on the Sabbath. And if you do any of these, then you're breaking the Sabbath. Last week, I gave you a list of all 39 of those things. And one of those things was that you are not allowed to knead. Like if you're making bread, you can't mix something up. We see there in the beginning of John chapter 9 that Jesus actually mixed up this mud. So technically, according to the Pharisees, Jesus broke the Sabbath. And so everyone's trying to figure out what's going on here. This man can see, but we don't know really how it happened. And it seems like some things happened that shouldn't have happened. So we better go and talk with the Pharisees and hash all of this out. So now we come to our 4th conversation, and the formerly blind man is in front of the Pharisees, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And they say, so tell us, what happened? And he tells them that a man named Jesus came and he put clay on his eyes and told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam, and now he can see. But here's what happens whenever you tell your story, is the first thing you'll see, and you see this in the passages here in the 4th conversation, is that people will begin to question it. Now, what happened? What happened? How? Wait, what? Then, if they're skeptics, and they may be, we run into a lot of skeptics, then they will try to poke holes in your story. Then often what we'll see is that they will attempt to prove that it never happened. So now the Pharisees, doubting that this thing even happened, feeling like maybe we're getting scammed, somebody is trying to claim a miracle that never happened, someone's trying to get over, and it's in front of us. Let's see, bring those parents in. This guy has parents, bring his parents in. And when they bring the parents in, that's our next conversation. And they ask the parents three basic questions. They ask him, number one, is this your son? And then number two, was he born blind? And number three, how did he receive his sight? And so the parents answer those questions pretty easily. They say, yes, this is our son, and yes, he was born blind. And then the last answer is a little interesting because they say, we don't know who. Now, they asked how did he get his sight back, not who gave him his sight back. But this is a telling statement because as we read a little further on in this chapter, we see that they're afraid because they've heard that the Pharisees do not want anyone to claim that Jesus is the Christ. And so they're trying to stay away from that. And they say, well, how'd this happen? And they go, we don't know who. Which is a little interesting. But then they say this, you can ask him because he is of age. And then that leads us to the sixth conversation. The Pharisees and the formerly blind man. We could call this the sequel. And this is where the story starts to get really good. It's been good so far. It's been really interesting. But when we start to look at this, it's something else. Let's take a look at this conversation. If we start in chapter 9, verse 24. And we're going to go through 33. We'll kind of read as we go. If you look at verse 24. So again, they called the man who was blind and said to him, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. Talking about Jesus. What an interesting statement. We know this man is a sinner. Not that we think this man is a sinner or that we suspect this man is a sinner or, you know what, this man may have done something that we think is sin. They say, we know this man is a sinner. Those no statements are really a challenge for believers. And do you know what I mean by that? The world, and particularly people who want to attack our faith, will usually come, maybe not usually, let's say often, will often come with a no statement. And do you know what I mean when I say that? Is that they'll say something like this. They'll say something like, well, you know the Bible wasn't written by God. Or they'll say, you know that Jesus said himself that he sinned. Or they'll say, you know, and you understand what I'm saying? And see, when they say that, when they say those kinds of statements, they're intended to throw us off balance because now they're saying something that they're making us feel that we're supposed to know, but we don't. See, it's a leverage tool. It presents a fact that hasn't been established as a fact, but they act like it's a fact. And so people will often do that to us. They'll go, well, you know, and then they'll say something that really isn't true, but they said it as if it was, and we may not have the information to push them back, and so we just accept it rather than admitting our ignorance and saying, well, you know what? No, I'm sorry. No, I didn't know that. Wait, you said there was a man on the news a couple of years ago, a famous newscaster on one of the stations, and he said that Jesus said that he was a sinner. And actually, I think he said, like, well, you know that Jesus himself said he was a sinner. You know, it made a lot of people say, oh, well, Jesus said that he was a sinner. But Jesus never said that. And so if just someone there would have said, well, no, I don't know that to be true. I mean, you're saying it as if it's true, and you could possibly be correct, but I'd need you to show me that information. I need to see that for myself. Look, let me go back and search this out, and then we can come back and finish this conversation, because you just said something that you say I should know, but I don't know that. But then the formerly blind man, he says something, he responds to them in a really interesting way. Look at verse 25. Because he says, whether this man is a sinner or not, one thing I know. Hey, have any of you remember this movie, and some of you may be too young to remember it. I think it came out in the early or mid-90s, but it was a movie called City Slickers with Billy Crystal and Jack Palance. And so they're riding along on these horses, and they're talking about their lives. But then he says this. He says, the secret to life is one thing. Like that blind man. That blind man, he said, look, whether or not Jesus is a sinner, I don't know. Look, you guys are experts in that area. I'm not an expert in that area. You guys know all these laws, and you're scholars, and you know all that. Look, I don't know about that stuff. But here's one thing I do know. The one thing I do know is I was blind, but now I see. You see, Curly, that was Jack Palance's character, he was right. There is one thing, and here's the other thing that he said, is that you have to figure it out for yourself, what that one thing is. Because someone will always challenge you. But here, when you run up against the best scholar in the world, the one thing that they cannot refute is your testimony. When you say, I was blind, but now I see, they cannot say, nah, you weren't. When you tell someone how messed up your life was, how twisted up you were on the inside, how you couldn't sleep at night and you had no peace and everything was falling apart. And then you met Jesus and your life began to come back together and everything wasn't fixed, but you were able to walk in peace. And you began to have wisdom that you didn't have before. And you began to understand things that you didn't understand before. See, no one can argue with that. They can tell you all these things about that's wrong with the Bible, that they think is wrong with the Bible. They can tell you all these things that's wrong with about what you believe about Jesus and what this religion does and what this religion doesn't do and all that. But here's what they can't argue with. They cannot argue with your testimony to what God has done in your life. And they'll try to explain away the things that you say happened in your life, the way that God spoke to your heart, the way that God lifted you up, the way that God helped you to think differently about things. They'll try. They'll always challenge you. But they can't win. Not when you know you were once blind, but now you see. Then we get to verse 26, and they ask this question. Well, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? They're like, well, what's the trick? How did he do it then? If you were really blind and now you can see, how did he do it? and I really start to like the blind man, or the formerly blind man, at this point in verse 27, because you begin to feel a little bit of his attitude, and you can tell that he begins to recognize what they're trying to do, and they're trying to make him a party to their mess. They're trying to use him as a tool for the war that they're trying to fight, and he's not having it. So look at verse 27, because he says this, I told you already. Did you not listen? Why do you want to hear it again? You know, I like watching courtroom dramas, and the lawyers at this point would object because they've already asked him that question. He's already explained it, and the lawyer would say, I object, asked and answered. This man, look, I've already answered that question for you. You asked it for me, I've answered it. Look, when someone keeps asking you the same questions about what you told them, here's what you know about that. Either they don't believe you, or they're trying to trip you up. And sometimes it's both. But that's the thing. And this man begins to jab back at them. So he says this, do you want to become his disciples? That's bold. These men have power. But you got to remember what this guy's been through. This is a full-grown man in front of them. And he has been blind since birth. And now he can see. Never seen anything before. Just in the last few hours, he saw his mother's face for the first time. He saw a flower. He saw the sun that he's always felt warm his face. He saw his father, who probably led him every day to the spot where he would beg. And they're trying to tell him that either it didn't happen or that some sinner made it happen. So he said, how many times do you want me to tell you? What? Why do you want to know? Oh, you want to follow him? You want to follow Jesus? And verse 28 says, they reviled him. Loiderero, which really means to villainize. To make him the villain was their plan. It says they reviled him. They said, you are his disciple, but we're Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. And as for this fella, we don't know where he's from. But if you go back to chapter 6, you know that they're not telling the truth. They were denying what they had been taught as if they hadn't been taught it. Because you remember the story. It's the fish and the loaves. And Jesus said, look, I gave you bread. The people came and they were trying to find Jesus because it was like a free buffet. It was free food. And he said, look, I gave you bread. And then he said that your fathers ate bread that came down from heaven, talking about manna. And you remember the children of Israel story, how God fed them in the desert, the bread from heaven. And then he said this, I am the bread that came down from heaven. I came down from heaven. Now, here's this newly cited beggar's rebuttal to what they said. Because remember what they said. They said that you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciple, and that we know that God speaks to Moses. And so this blind man, he rebuts them by giving them his own you know statement. But his you know statement is true, because he says we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Isn't that amazing? I mean, think about it. That here's what he said. And one of the things that we know is that one of the telltale signs of the Messiah, and I shared it last week, is that the Messiah would give sight to the blind. Here's what we know historically. Before this point, it had never happened before. You read your Old Testament. You search through history. There's never been a blind man that was given his sight until Jesus showed up. And this blind man who received his sight said, look, I don't know a whole lot, but I know this. This one thing I know, I was blind and I can see. And I also know that God doesn't hear the prayers of sinners. And so if God doesn't hear the prayers of sinners, then how did I get healed if that man is a sinner? The scripture says they cast him out. They threw him out. They couldn't deal with him. They threw him out. And that brings us to conversation 7. Jesus and the formerly blind man. Jesus heard that they cast him out. And when he had found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of God? Now look, here's what you have to see. That when you stand for right, sometimes you will be cast out. It's not going to work out well for you. People are going to talk about you. Sometimes it's going to cost you something. Sometimes you're not going to be included anymore. I mean, and there are times, and the world is coming to this, so we have to get ready that telling the truth will get you in trouble. You'll end up behind bars, or possibly even dead. But here's what we see from this blind man, or formerly blind man, who tells the truth about who Jesus is. Because at first he says he was a man called Jesus. And in that other conversation, we didn't cover it here this week. It was last week. Then he says, when they ask him, well, who do you think that he was? The blind man, or the formerly blind man, says, he's obviously a prophet. So he went from being a man called Jesus to being a prophet. Some scholars believe that the reason that man said a prophet was because that was the highest spiritual position the man could think of. So he said he's a prophet, and so they cast him out, and then it says Jesus found him. Look, when you get yourself in trouble for Jesus, when you stand for him, when you do what's right, even though it's not popular, when you tell the truth in love, even though people don't want to hear it, it will cost you. You will be hurt. You will be damaged. You will be pushed down. You will be pushed out. But here's what we see is that God comes to find you. He will be there. And notice what didn't happen. And I hate to say this because it's against our Western values. Jesus did not have him reinstated into the temple. Jesus didn't make it all right. Jesus didn't fix it. But he fixed him. See, and that's what God will do. Sometimes he doesn't fix our problems. When we stand for him, sometimes we deal with that pain of standing with him. And it doesn't always physically work out in our favor. You know, our staff last year read a really good book called The Just Church, written by a guy named Jim Martin. And in that book, he talked about something called failure points. And failure points are the places in our life where we try to do something and then we fail. It doesn't work out. To everyone else, it looks like failure. That we try to do the right thing, but we fail. And in that, he points us to James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. And he says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." I don't like that. I want the verse that said God always fixes it. That God always makes it feel good. That God always brings it back around so that it's easy. But he says that our trials will produce joy and maturity. It's like we see Peter and John in Acts chapter 5, and it actually starts in Acts chapter 4, where they heal this man at the gate called Beautiful. It causes a ruckus. They begin to preach about Jesus. Everybody wants to know what's going on. They get dragged before the leaders, and the leaders tell them, "You guys knock it off. Stop talking about this Jesus, and they put up their own defense, and it goes really well. They don't know what to do with them. And so they say, okay, well, you guys can leave, but stop talking about Jesus. And they say, no, we're not going to stop talking about Jesus. Who are we going to obey, God or man? And they said, okay, well, then if that's your question, then we're going to show you who to obey. And they throw them in jail. The men are in jail, and in the middle of the night, an angel comes and gets them out of jail. The next morning, the jailers realize that they're gone, but the doors are still locked. No one broke them out. They just got out. They think they've escaped. Now me, if that would have happened to me, I'd have got out and said, whoop, thanks, and hit the road. They wouldn't have found me again. But the scripture says that Peter and John went right back to the center square and began preaching about Jesus. So they get arrested again. They're told, stop preaching about Jesus. And again, they say, no, we have to. We're going to obey God. A man named Gamaliel says, well, you know what? Let's let them go. Because if what they're doing is of God, it'll work. If it's not, it won't. So they didn't just let them go. They beat them before they let them go. And look at what verse 41 of chapter 5, the book of Acts says. So they departed from the presence of the council. What's that word say? Rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. What did James chapter 1 say? Consider it joy. When you go through trials. And these guys are rejoicing after they've been beaten. Maybe for some of us, the reason we don't have joy like that never mind. Let's let me say, maybe because we're unwilling to suffer anything. We're unwilling to take a stand for Jesus for anything. So we have no spiritual trial in that way. And so there's no joy that rises up in the middle of that trial. Because it's not there. The trial, not the joy. That leads us to the last conversation, John chapter 9. Conversation number 8. Jesus and the Pharisees. And this man, having been cast out, says, Lord, I believe. And worshiped Jesus. Verse 39 says this, and Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may be made blind. A blind man sees, and those who can see are obviously blind. And that's something. That's what we see in this chapter, that a blind man sees. But for those who can obviously see, they can't really see. But look at verse 40. Then some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words, and they said to him, "Are we blind also?" You talking about us? Are you saying we're blind? And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, 'We see.' Therefore, your sin remains." If you remember, if you go back several verses, right before the Pharisees cast the formerly blind man out, they told him that he was born of sin. They were talking about him or his parents. They were saying, look, the reason you were blind is because you're a sinner. Get out of here. Jesus says, look, a blind person recognizes that they can't see. They know they need some help. But people who can see fool themselves into thinking they're self-sufficient. This blind man met God. God made him see. He was so thankful. When he said, "Do you know who the Son of God is?" And the man said, I don't know him. Jesus said, "You see him. He's right in front of you." The man said, "I believe," and he called him Lord. He bowed down and worshiped. That's what God calls from us. Look, that we recognize we're blind and we need him. And that when we see it, he heals us. So Jesus goes from a man called Jesus to a prophet to Lord. Seemed like all in one afternoon. Who is Jesus to you? Is Jesus a man? Is he a prophet? Or is he Lord?